Hey, welcome listeners. Have you ever wondered what becomes of a people when their last storyteller falls silent? What happens to entire worlds that thrived for thousands of years yet left behind nothing but scattered stones and faint whispers buried in the earth? Tonight we're not just telling history. We're reaching into the silence before history even began. Picture a world younger, wilder. Small bands of humans moving like shadows across vast, untamed landscapes, living lives so vivid, yet destined to vanish long before anyone thought, to carve their names in stone or clay. Have you ever thought about the footsteps that came before all recorded footsteps? The songs that were sung in languages now lost forever. The voices that rose around fires and then disappeared into the wind. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. There's something strangely comforting about knowing we're all drifting into this mystery together from different corners of the world, connected by the same curiosity. For those who came before us, now dim the lights. Maybe let a gentle fan hum in the background. We're about to slip back 12,000 years to the edges of the great ice, where small tribes wandered through a world melting and reshaping beneath their feet. Their stories were never written, never carved, never passed to scribes. But if you listen closely to the wind through ancient valleys, you might still catch the echoes, the quiet struggles, the small triumphs, the fragile hope that kept them moving forward. Tonight you'll walk where they walked. You'll feel the weight of their survival, the warmth of their fleeting joys, and the strange beauty of a life lived without the thought of permanence. So close your eyes, and let's step into a time when every sunrise was both a gift and a question mark. You wake to seep of cold moisture through the animal hide beneath you. The earth is never truly dry, never truly warm. Even when you've carefully chosen your sleeping spot, away from the low places where frost gathers, sheltered by the twisted trunk of an ancient birch, dampness finds you. It creeps through the carefully sewn seams of your sleeping fur, a patient invader that has claimed another night's rest. Your shoulder, the one you always seem to favor, aches with a deep, bone-settled cold that will take the better part of the morning to work free. Imagine yourself there in those first moments between sleep and waking, when consciousness returns like water seeping through cracked earth. The sounds around you tell their own story. The soft snores of your kinsfolk, the distant crack of settling wood in the dying fire, and always the whisper of wind through grass that never stops moving. This is the soundtrack of your existence, as constant as your own heartbeat. You are part of something small and precious, a band of perhaps 20 souls bound together by necessity and blood, moving endlessly across a landscape that shows no mercy and promises no rest. The rhythm of your days has been the same for as long as anyone can remember. Wake, gather, hunt, move, survive. The ritual never varies, because variation means death. Your hands know the weight of hunger before your mind fully awakens. Before you even open your eyes, your fingers move instinctively to your belly. The hollow feeling there tells you everything you need to know about yesterday's success or lack thereof. Food is not a comfort in your world. It is a fleeting victory, a temporary postponement of the gnawing ache that serves as your most faithful companion. You have learned to measure time not by the sun's position, but by the intensity of your body's demands. Rising from your sleeping place requires a careful orchestration of stiff joints and reluctant muscles. The cold has settled into your bones like an unwelcome tenant, and each movement sends sharp reminders through your frame. Your feet, wrapped in carefully maintained leather, touch ground that yields like a sponge. The morning dew has mixed with yesterday's mud, creating a surface that will squelch and pull. At every step you take today, the fire is your first concern, always your first concern. You move toward the dying embers with the practiced quiet of someone who has learned that sudden movements in the pre-dawn darkness can startle others into panic. Fire is life. Fire is warmth. Fire is the thin barrier between your small band and the vast, indifference of the natural world. You kneel beside the carefully constructed ring of stones, feeling the faint warmth that still radiates from last night's burning. Your hands already cracked from constant exposure to wind and weather. Work with automatic precision. Gathering tinder is an art you have perfected through necessity. Your fingers find the driest bark, the most promising twigs, the perfect arrangement of materials that might coax flame from ember. Each breath you blow into the glowing heart of the fire pit is measured, deliberate. Too little and the spark dies. Too much and you scatter the precious heat you're trying to nurture. This is how you begin every day, on your knees, breathing life into something that wants to die. Your stomach contracts with familiar emptiness as the fire takes hold. The growing light reveals the faces of your companions emerging from their own struggles with cold and stiffness. You see the same careful assessment in their eyes that you feel in your own. Who looks strong enough for today's challenges? Who seems to be fighting something deeper than cold? The old woman, Tall's grandmother, coughs in a way that sends worry through the group like ripples through still water. Each person's health is everyone's concern, because the loss of even one pair of hands, one set of eyes, one store of knowledge, diminishes your chances of seeing another season. The morning meal, if it can be called that, consists of whatever survived yesterday's gathering. Perhaps a handful of roots, their earthy sweetness, more imagination than reality. Maybe strips of meat so carefully preserved that they have the texture of leather and require long, patient chewing to yield any nourishment. You eat slowly, not from any sense of savoring, but because rushing food through your system can bring its own problems. Every calorie must be stretched, every morsel made to last. Water is your next concern, and it is never simple. The nearby stream runs clear, but you have learned not to trust appearances. Water can carry invisible death, can harbor sickness that will drop strong hunters to their knees within days. You taste it carefully, letting a small amount rest on your tongue before swallowing. The elders have taught you to read water like others. Read the sky. This stream, tastes of stone and snow melt clean, but cold enough to shock your empty stomach. You drink in small sips, feeling the liquid trace a path through your center. Temporary relief for a thirst that never fully disappears. Filling the water containers, carefully sewn bladders and hollowed gourds, requires planning. The containers must be clean, the water source must be reliable, and the weight must be balanced against the distance you plan to travel. Every decision branches into more decisions, each one carrying consequences that might not become apparent until days later. The morning's first major task is always the same: deciding where death is least likely to find you. Today, you gather with the others in a circle that has formed itself without conscious planning. This is how your people have always made decisions, not through hierarchy or force, but through the slow process of speaking, listening and feeling for the path that offers the best chance of survival. The conversation flows in the old language, words worn smooth by generations of use, carrying meanings that would take paragraphs to explain in any tongue that exists today. Should you follow the river valley, where water is certain but where larger predators also gather? Should you climb toward the ridgeline, where the view is better but where exposure to wind and weather will drain your strength? Each option carries its own burden of risk, its own promise of hardship. There is no good choice, only choices that might prove less fatal than others. Your hands begin their daily work before the decision is even finalized. While the adults debate direction and distance, your fingers find familiar tasks, checking the bindings on your tools, ensuring that the carefully crafted spear points remain secure in their wooden shafts, feeling along the length of your digging stick for signs of weakness or wear. These implements are not just tools, they are extensions of your body, crafted with the same care you might give to a beloved child. The making of a proper tool can take days, even weeks. First, the selection of materials, wood that has the right balance of hardness and flexibility, stone that will hold an edge, sinew that will bind without breaking. Then the careful process of shaping, testing, adjusting. A poorly made tool is worse than no tool at all, because it offers false confidence while promising failure. At the moment when failure means death, your clothing tells the story of every successful hunt, every clever adaptation. The furs and hides that cover your body represent countless hours of work, not just in their taking but in their preparation. Each piece has been carefully scraped clean, treated with mixtures of brain and fat to prevent rot, sewn with sinew using bone needles that themselves represent significant investments of time and skill. Your clothing is not fashion, it is architecture designed to trap warmth, shed water and allow for the range of movement that survival demands. The repairs never end. Each day brings new tears, new worn spots, new challenges to the integrity of your personal survival system. You have learned to see clothing as a living thing requiring constant attention and care. A small hole left untended can grow into a major breach that might let in killing cold on the wrong night. The morning's light reveals yesterday's failures and promises today's challenges. As the sun climbs higher, painting the landscape in shades of possibility, you can see the signs of your passage through this place. The flattened grass where you slept, the scattered remains of last night's fire, the small disturbances that mark where 20 people tried to live for a few hours without dying. In a day or two, wind and weather will erase these traces. In a generation, no one will remember that your people ever passed this way. This is perhaps the most exhausting truth of your existence. Not just the daily struggle for survival, but the growing certainty that your struggle will leave no permanent mark on the world. You have no written language to record your thoughts, no monuments to mark your passing, no legacy beyond the children you managed to raise to adulthood. Your entire civilization exists in the memories of 20 people, and when those memories fail, everything your ancestors learned, everything they discovered, everything they achieved will disappear as completely as morning mist gathering begins. Before hunger becomes desperation, you set out from the temporary camp with containers for collection and tools for digging. The search for edible plants requires knowledge passed down through countless generations, which roots can be eaten raw, which require careful preparation to avoid poisoning, which offer the most nourishment for the energy spent in gathering them. This knowledge exists nowhere but in the minds of the elders, and every day brings the possibility that some crucial piece of information might be lost forever. The work is backbreaking in its simplicity. You kneel beside promising plants, carefully digging around root systems with your stick, testing the soil for the telltale signs of the foods that might keep your people alive another day. Your knees grow damp from the earth, your back aches from the constant bending, and your hands become so caked with soil that you forget what clean feels like. Each plant you harvest represents a small gamble. Is this root mature enough to provide real nourishment? Will the energy you spend digging it up be justified by the calories it provides? Have you taken enough to feed the hungry, but not so much that you destroy the plant's ability to produce food for future seasons? These calculations happen automatically, the result of knowledge so deeply embedded that it feels like instinct. The afternoon brings the weight of accumulating exhaustion. By the time the sun reaches its highest point, you have already walked miles, dug dozens of roots, and tested the edibility of everything you've encountered. Your water container is lighter, your energy reserves are lower, and the constant calculation of survival has worn grooves in your consciousness. You rest when rest is possible, but rest is a luxury that must be carefully rationed. The landscape around you changes with each mile, presenting new opportunities and new dangers. A grove of trees might offer shelter and the possibility of nuts or fruits, but it might also conceal predators or other bands of humans whose intentions are unknown. An open meadow allows you to see approaching threats, but offers no protection from wind, rain, or the eyes of those who might see you as competition or prey. Your tribe moves through the world like a whisper. The afternoon march is a study in collective stealth. 20 people crossing open ground, leaving as little trace as possible, avoiding the places where other tribes might gather, staying away from the obvious paths that predators use. You have learned to read the landscape like a story. This flattened grass suggests recent passage. Those scattered bones indicate a successful hunt. The absence of birdsong in that particular thicket suggests something large and dangerous has taken residence. Their communication during travel happens through glances, hand signals, and subtle changes in posture. Loud voices carry too far, attract too much attention. The language of survival is largely silent, a vocabulary of caution written in footsteps and breathing patterns. You have learned to trust the collective wisdom of the group, to move when movement is called for, to freeze when stillness might mean the difference between life and death. Evening approaches with the weight of accumulated fatigue. As the sun begins its descent toward the horizon, your body carries the full burden of another day's survival. Your feet ache inside their leather wrappings, your shoulders burn from carrying gathering bags and tools, and your hunger has grown from an inconvenience to a driving force that colors every thought. The search for tonight's shelter becomes urgent, a place that offers protection from wind, concealment from other eyes, and access to the resources you'll need for tomorrow's continuation of the endless journey. Setting up camp is a choreographed effort that happens without discussion. Everyone knows their role. Everyone understands the priorities: fire pit location, sleeping arrangements, water access, escape routes. All of these considerations are weighed and addressed with the efficiency that comes from repetition and necessity. Your temporary home must serve multiple purposes: fortress, workshop, kitchen, and sanctuary. The day ends as it began, with uncertainty wrapped in exhaustion. As darkness settles over your small camp, you find yourself facing the same questions that ended yesterday and will begin tomorrow. Is everyone healthy enough for another day's travel? Are your food reserves sufficient to carry the group through tomorrow's challenges? Will the weather hold, or will rain or cold add new levels of difficulty to an already challenging existence? You settle into your sleeping furs knowing that tomorrow will bring variations on today's theme. The same basic struggles played out against a slightly different backdrop. The same careful balance between energy expenditure and caloric intake. The same constant awareness that you are always one mistake, one injury, one stroke of bad luck away from becoming another set of bones scattered across a landscape that remembers nothing. The wind continues its endless whisper through the grass around your camp, carrying scents and sounds from a world that extends far beyond the small circle of firelight that defines your universe. Somewhere in that darkness, other small bands face their own versions of your challenges. Somewhere in that vastness, predators hunt and prey, flee, plants grow and die, and the great cycle of survival continues its ancient rhythm. Sleep comes fitfully interrupted by cold, by hunger, by the sounds of a world that never truly rests. Your dreams, when they come, are simple things, visions of successful hunts, of bellies filled with good food, of warm, dry places where the wind cannot reach. But even in sleep, part of your consciousness remains alert, listening for the sounds that might signal danger, ready to wake and move at the first sign that your small band's temporary safety has been compromised. This is how you live, how your people have always lived. In the space between sleeping and waking, between safety and danger, between having enough and having nothing at all. Tomorrow will bring new variations on ancient themes, new challenges wrapped in familiar struggles, and, if you are fortunate, if you are careful, if the world shows you its occasional mercy, you will survive to face another day exactly like this one, in an endless cycle that connects you to all the lost tribes that came before and to all the forgotten people who lived and died without leaving. Names for history to remember. As the embers of our campfire settle into glowing memory, let us drift toward another kind of warmth. The quiet flame of a single life lived in the vastness of forgotten time. Her story begins in winter's deepest grip, when the world had contracted to nothing more than the space that firelight could hold against the dark. Tall entered existence during one of those nights when survival balanced on the edge of a blade, when her mother's labored breathing competed with the wind's howl for dominance over the small shelter that 20 souls called home. The birth shelter was nothing more than carefully arranged branches and animal hides, but it might as well have been a palace for all the hope it contained. Her grandmother, whose weathered hands had guided dozens of children into the world, worked by the flickering light of burning animal fat, whispering the old words that were meant to ease the passage from the warm darkness of the womb into the cold uncertainty of tribal life. Imagine the moment when Tall's first cry pierced the winter silence, that sound thin, defiant, utterly vulnerable, carried across the frozen landscape like a declaration of intent. Here was another human willing to struggle against the indifference of the natural world, another set of hands that might someday contribute to the tribe's survival, another mind that would need to learn the thousand subtle lessons that meant the difference between life and death. Her father crouched outside the birth shelter with the other men, felt something shift in his chest when he heard that cry. Relief, certainly, that both mother and child had survived the dangerous passage, but also something deeper, a weight settling onto his shoulders. The knowledge that his responsibilities had just multiplied in ways that would shape every decision he made for the rest of his life. The tribe's shaman, an old man whose memory contained more stories than anyone else alive, approached the shelter as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. In his hands, he carried a small piece of ochre, red as dried blood, warm as hope. This would be Tall's first gift from the world, a mark on her forehead that would fade within days, but which would bind her forever to the ancient chain of custom that connected her to all the people who had come before. In those first days of life, Tall existed in a bubble of protective warmth. Her mother kept her close skin against skin, sharing body heat that was more precious than any other resource the tribe possessed. The milk that sustained her came at a cost, measured in the mother's own reserves, calories taken from a body that could barely spare them. But this was how the tribe survived, through the endless cycle of sacrifice and investment, each generation pouring its remaining strength into the possibility that the next generation might find a way to thrive. The other women took turns holding her when her mother needed to rest, work, or simply remember what it felt like to move through the world without carrying another life. These moments of shared care were not just practical necessity but sacred trust. Each woman who cradled Tall was investing in the tribe's future, claiming a small stake in the hope that this child might grow to carry forward the knowledge they had spent their lives accumulating. As winter slowly loosened its grip and the first signs of spring appeared, Tall began to engage with the world beyond her mother's arms. Her eyes, dark and curious, tracked the movement of flames, followed the gentle motions of people moving about their daily tasks. Her small hands learned to grasp, first accidentally, then with growing intention, reaching for the textures and temperatures that would eventually teach her about the physical reality of survival. The rhythm of her early days followed the ancient pattern of nomadic life. When the tribe moved, Tall moved with them, carried in a carefully crafted sling that distributed her weight across her mother's shoulders and back. These early journeys imprinted themselves on her developing consciousness, the steady rhythm of footsteps, the subtle sway of her mother's gait, the changing quality of light and shadow as they traveled through different landscapes. She learned the tribe's geography before she learned its language, absorbing through her senses the difference between river valleys and open plains, between the close warmth of forest camps and the exposed vulnerability of ridgeline travel. Her small body registered changes in altitude through the pressure in her ears, learned to anticipate weather shifts through the tension in her mother's posture, began to understand the subtle communications that flowed constantly between the adults who surrounded her. By her first summer, Tall had begun to contribute to the tribe's survival in the smallest possible way, by being quiet when quiet was necessary, by sleeping when sleep was the safest option, by accepting discomfort without the kind of crying that might attract unwanted attention. These may seem like modest accomplishments, but in a world where the wrong sound at the wrong moment could bring disaster, even infant cooperation carried life or death significance. Her first steps came during the season of plenty, when the earth offered its most generous gifts. The meadow where Tall learned to walk was rich with the kind of abundance that her people encountered, perhaps once or twice each year. Wild grains heavy with seed, fruit, trees offering more than could be immediately consumed, streams running clear and full of mountain snowmelt. It was in this temporary paradise that she found the courage to release her grip on her mother's leg and venture 3 unsteady steps toward her grandmother's outstretched arms. Those first independent movements represented more than personal development. They marked Tall's transition from pure burden to potential contributor. A child who could walk, could help gather, could carry small loads, could begin to learn the intricate lessons of survival that would need to become second nature before her body finished growing. Her grandmother became her first teacher, guiding her small hands toward edible plants, showing her which roots were worth the effort of digging, demonstrating how to test the not ripeness of berries without destroying them. These lessons happened without formal structure, woven into the fabric of daily life like threads in a tapestry. Tall learned by watching, by imitating, by making small mistakes that her grandmother's experience could correct before they became dangerous. Language came to her like water seeping into dry earth. The tribe's tongue was not written, would never be written, existed only in the minds and mouths of the people who carried it from season to season. Tall absorbed this language through constant exposure, her young brain mapping sounds to meanings, learning the subtle differences that distinguished a warning from a greeting, a question from a command. But she also learned the other languages that governed tribal life, the language of gesture and posture that allowed for communication during hunts when speech might betray their presence, the language of tool-making that connected hand to material to purpose, the language of weather and landscape that could mean the difference between finding shelter and dying of exposure. Her first words were practical ones: mama, water, hungry, cold. But gradually her vocabulary expanded to include concepts that had no equivalent in any tongue that exists today. Words for the specific quality of light that meant storm was approaching, terms for the subtle signs that indicated whether other humans had recently passed through an area, expressions that captured the precise degree of trust appropriate when encountering strangers. By her 3rd year, Tall had begun to understand the weight of survival. She watched her grandmother's hands grow more gnarled with each passing season, noticed how the old woman moved more slowly each morning, saw the way the adults exchanged glances when they thought the children weren't watching. Death was not an abstract concept in her world. It was a constant presence, a shadow that followed every decision, a reality that shaped every moment of every day. She learned about loss during a harsh winter, when her youngest uncle, barely past childhood himself, developed the coughing sickness that turned his breath ragged and his skin the color of old snow. Tall watched the adults take turns sitting with him, feeding him warm broths when he could keep them down, singing the old songs that were meant to ease the passage between worlds. When he died, she learned about the rituals that her people used to mark such transitions, the careful preparation of the body, the selection of grave goods that would accompany him on whatever journey awaited beyond breathing. the long night of storytelling that transformed individual memory into collective heritage. Her uncle's death became part of the tribe's larger story, his struggles and small triumphs woven into the narrative tapestry that would survive as long as there were voices to carry it forward. Her training as a gatherer began in earnest as she approached her 4th year. Tall's education and survival was not a matter of sitting still while adults spoke. It was a constant process of observation, participation, and gradual assumption of responsibility. She learned to identify edible plants not through memorization but through repeated exposure. Her hands learning to recognize the texture of valuable roots, her nose developing the ability to distinguish between safe and dangerous fungi. Her small fingers proved surprisingly adept at the delicate work of seed collection, their size allowing her to extract nutrition from sources that adult hands might damage or overlook. She learned to move through vegetation without disturbing it unnecessarily, to take only what was needed to leave enough behind to ensure that future seasons would offer similar abundance. The knowledge she absorbed during these gathering expeditions was encyclopedic in its scope and utterly practical in its application. She learned which barks could be processed into fiber strong enough for binding, which leaves could be used to treat common ailments, which stones held the right qualities for tool making. This information existed nowhere except in the minds of her teachers, and every lesson carried the weight of potential survival. Her first successful hunt was a moment of quiet triumph. The prey was modest, a ground-dwelling bird that had been injured and could not fly, but the skills required to track it, approach it, and dispatch it cleanly were the same ones she would need to master if she hoped to contribute meaningfully to the tribe's survival. Tall's small spear, crafted especially for her developing strength, found its mark with a precision that brought approving nods from the adults who had been watching from a respectful distance. But the kill was only the beginning of the lesson. Tall learned how to process the bird efficiently, wasting nothing, transforming every part of the small body into something useful. Meat for immediate consumption, bones for tool-making, feathers for decoration, and insulation sinew for binding. The process took hours and required the kind of patience that could only be developed through repetition and guidance. Her grandmother showed her how to give thanks for the life that had been taken, speaking words that acknowledged the bird's sacrifice and the responsibility it placed on those who would benefit from its death. This was not sentimentality, but practical wisdom. People who understood the cost of survival were less likely to waste precious resources, more likely to make decisions that honored the difficulty of staying alive in an unforgiving world. As Tall grew stronger, the tribe itself faced increasing challenges. The abundance that had marked her early childhood began to give way to leaner times. The herds that her people had followed for generations started to migrate along different routes, following changes in climate and vegetation that made their traditional hunting grounds less reliable. Water, sources that had flowed consistently for as long as anyone could remember, began to run dry during the hottest parts of summer. These changes forced the tribe to adapt in ways that stressed their traditional knowledge. Elders who had spent lifetimes learning the patterns of their territory found themselves guessing about conditions in unfamiliar landscapes. The careful balance between resource consumption and renewal that had sustained the tribe for countless generations began to show signs of strain. Tall, now approaching her 7th year, was old enough to understand that something fundamental was shifting in her world. The adults spoke in hushed tones about the possibility of joining with other bands, sharing resources and knowledge in ways that had not been necessary in living memory. These conversations carried undertones of both hope and fear, hope that cooperation might offer solutions to their mounting challenges, fear that change itself might destroy the traditions that had sustained them through previous difficulties. Her first encounter with strangers came during a season of particular hardship. The other band appeared on the horizon like a mirage, wavering in the heat of a summer that had been unusually dry and demanding. Tall watched from behind her mother's legs as the two groups approached each other with the careful formality that such meetings required. Every gesture was significant, every word chosen for its potential to either ease tension or trigger conflict. The negotiations that followed were complex beyond Tall's understanding, involving the exchange of information about water sources and game movements, the sharing of food resources, the delicate process of determining whether temporary cooperation might benefit both groups. She observed the way her own people presented themselves, confident but not aggressive, needy but not desperate, open to alliance but prepared for betrayal. In the end, the two bands traveled together for several weeks, their combined knowledge allowing them to navigate challenges that might have overwhelmed either group. Alone, Tall learned that survival sometimes required the expansion of trust beyond blood, relationships that the boundaries of us and them could shift depending on circumstances, that the skills her people had developed for internal cooperation could sometimes be extended to encompass strangers. By her 9th year, Tall had begun to sense the fragility of everything she had learned to value. The grandmother, who had been her primary teacher, was showing clear signs of the decline that comes to all who live long enough to see their bodies betray their accumulated wisdom. Her hands, once so sure in their movements, sometimes trembled when performing delicate tasks. Her memory, still vast and detailed, occasionally produced moments of confusion that frightened Tall more than she could articulate. The prospect of losing her grandmother meant more than personal grief. It meant the potential loss of knowledge that existed nowhere else, techniques and insights that had been refined through generations of trial and error. Tall found herself listening more intently to the old woman's stories, trying to absorb not just the surface information, but the deeper patterns of thought that had allowed her grandmother to survive when so many others had not. During long evenings beside carefully tended fires, her grandmother began to share the deeper mysteries of their people's existence, the stories that explained how the world had come to be shaped, as it was the wisdom that connected individual survival to larger patterns of meaning, the understanding that allowed a person to face death with dignity rather than despair. Her transition toward adulthood was marked by increasingly difficult challenges. Tall's body began to change in ways that signaled her approaching ability to contribute to the next generation, but these changes came at a time when the tribe's long-term prospects seemed increasingly uncertain. The territory they had traversed for generations was no longer reliable in its abundance. Other bands facing similar pressures had become more territorial, less willing to share information about resources or safe passage. The rituals that marked her passage toward womanhood were adapted to acknowledge these changing circumstances. The traditional patterns of preparation and celebration were modified to emphasize skills that might be particularly important in the difficult times that seemed to lie ahead. Tall learned not just the ancient arts of her people, but variations and alternatives that might serve when traditional methods proved insufficient. Her education now included knowledge that previous generations had not needed to consider: how to evaluate whether strangers might be trustworthy allies or dangerous competitors, how to cache resources in ways that might allow the tribe to survive extended periods of scarcity, how to read landscapes for signs of long-term changes that might require fundamental alterations in their way of life. The winter of her 11th year brought tests that would define the rest of her story. The cold that season was unlike anything in living memory, arriving early and settling into the landscape with a permanence that challenged every assumption about seasonal cycles. Food became scarce in ways that forced desperate choices, whether to consume seed stock that had been saved for planting, whether to hunt animals that were normally protected to ensure future populations, whether to abandon traditional territories in search of conditions that might be more favorable. Tal watched her people make these decisions through the democratic process that had always guided their survival. But she could see the strain that impossible choices placed on relationships that had previously been sources of strength. Arguments arose about priorities and strategies, disagreements that reflected not personal animosity, but the desperate difficulty of choosing between bad options and worse ones. Her grandmother died during the deepest part of that winter, slipping away during a night when the wind howled like all the voices of the departed, calling from beyond the edge of existence. Tal held the old woman's hand as her breathing grew shallow and finally stopped feeling. The precise moment when accumulated wisdom became memory, when living knowledge transformed into story. The spring that followed brought both relief and recognition of irreplaceable loss. As the world began to warm and the immediate threat of death by freezing receded, Tal found herself occupying a position she had not expected to hold so young. With her grandmother's death, she had become one of the primary keepers of knowledge about plant lore, tool-making, and the subtle skills that sustained daily life. The weight of this responsibility was almost crushing. She was not yet fully adult, but circumstances had made her wisdom essential to the tribe's survival. Her days became a constant balance between learning and teaching, between absorbing the guidance of the remaining elders and passing along what she knew to the children who looked to her for instruction. She found herself speaking words that had come from her grandmother's lips, using gestures and techniques that connected her to a chain of knowledge stretching back through generations of successful survivors. The summer of her 12th year brought the encounter that would change everything. The strangers who appeared in their territory were unlike any people Tal had ever seen. Their tools were different. Their clothing was constructed using techniques that seemed impossible. Their speech contained sounds that made no sense to ears trained in the traditional language. Most remarkably, they possessed knowledge that allowed them to shape the landscape itself. They had built structures that remained in place, season after season, had developed methods of encouraging certain plants to grow where they wanted them to grow. The negotiations between Tal's people and these strangers were complex beyond anything. In their previous experience, the newcomers spoke of concepts that had no equivalents in the traditional vocabulary. Permanent settlements stored surplus territories that belonged to specific groups rather than being shared by all who passed through them. They offered to share their knowledge, but the price seemed to be the abandonment of the nomadic lifestyle that had sustained Tal's people for countless generations. The decision that followed would determine whether Tal's story continued or ended. The debates within the tribe extended through many nights, exploring possibilities that ranged from complete rejection of the stranger's offer to total abandonment of traditional ways. Tal found herself arguing for a middle path, selective adoption of useful techniques while maintaining the core values and practices that had allowed her people to survive in conditions that defeated other approaches to existence. But even as she spoke, she could sense that the world was changing in ways that would make such compromises impossible. The abundance that had once supported nomadic life was disappearing, replaced by conditions that favored people who could store resources, build shelters, and defend fixed territories. The skills that had sustained her ancestors for millennia were becoming insufficient for the challenges that the future would bring. In the end, Tal's story becomes part of a larger transformation. The choice her tribe ultimately made was to join with the strangers, contributing their knowledge of the land and its resources in exchange for access to new techniques of survival. Tal herself became a bridge between worlds, teaching traditional plant lore to people who applied it in their permanent gardens, sharing hunting techniques that were adapted for use in defending settled territories. But something was lost in this transformation. Not just specific practices, but an entire way of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world. The patient mobility that had allowed her people to live lightly on the land gave way to methods that required permanent alteration of landscapes. The collective decision-making that had guided nomadic survival was gradually replaced by systems that concentrated authority in individuals who claimed special knowledge or divine sanction. Tal lived to see her children grow in this new world. Her daughter learned to tend crops that grew in the same place year after year, mastering agricultural techniques that would have been incomprehensible to Tal's grandmother. Her son became skilled in the construction of permanent structures, learning to work with materials and methods that transformed the landscape rather than adapting to it. They were successful in their new lives, but they lived in a world that their ancestors would not have recognized as home. As Tal aged, she found herself becoming the repository of knowledge that seemed increasingly irrelevant to daily survival. The plant lore that had once been essential was replaced by domesticated varieties that required different care. The hunting skills that had sustained her people were less important in a world where protein came from animals that were raised rather than tracked. Her final years were spent as a keeper of stories that fewer and fewer people understood. The young ones who grew up in the permanent settlement had difficulty comprehending the challenges that had defined Tal's early life. To them, the idea of moving constantly in search of resources seemed inefficient and unnecessarily difficult. The notion that people had once lived without stored surplus, without permanent shelter, without the ability to control their environment, struck them as primitive rather than adaptive. Tal tried to preserve the old knowledge by transforming it into stories that might survive, even when their practical applications were forgotten. She spoke of her grandmother's wisdom, of the techniques that had sustained countless generations, of the understanding that had allowed small bands of humans to thrive in conditions that challenge every aspect of their existence. But even stories can die when no one remains who understands their significance. As Tal's voice grew weak and her memory began to falter, she realized that much of what she had learned would die with her. The detailed knowledge of seasonal patterns, the subtle indicators that predicted weather changes, the techniques for processing wild foods. All of this was becoming irrelevant in a world that operated according to different principles. Her death, when it came, marked the end of something that had existed for thousands of years. With her passing, the last direct connection to the nomadic traditions was severed. The people who remained carried forward selected elements of the old knowledge, but the integrated understanding that had allowed their ancestors to thrive as mobile hunter-gatherers was lost forever. And so Tal's story ends as it began, in silence. The wisdom she had accumulated, the skills she had mastered, the understanding she had developed through a lifetime of careful observation and patient learning, all of this disappeared, as completely as if it had never existed. The world moved forward according to new patterns, guided by different principles, shaped by technologies and social arrangements that would have been unimaginable to the people who had raised her. In the space of a single generation, an entire way of life had vanished. The techniques that had sustained humans through the long transition from Ice Age to agricultural abundance were forgotten. The stories that had preserved essential knowledge were no longer told. The languages that had carried subtle distinctions and crucial information were replaced by new vocabulary suited to different kinds of challenges. Tal's life spanned the bridge between two worlds, but the bridge itself disappeared when she did. After her death, there was no one left who could remember what it had felt like to wake each morning uncertain of where that night's shelter would be found. No one who retained the skills necessary for reading landscapes as sources of temporary abundance. No one who understood the social arrangements that had allowed small groups to make collective decisions about survival. Her story ends in the silence that claims all stories, when the last person who remembers them stops breathing. But perhaps in the quiet moments when wind moves through ancient grasslands, when firelight dances against darkness, when the rhythm of footsteps creates its own meditation, perhaps then, something of Tall's world still whispers in the spaces between what we remember and what we have forgotten. As Tall's story fades into the silence that claims all forgotten voices, let us turn our attention to what remains. The faint whispers that patient Earth still holds. The subtle signs that speak to those who know how to listen. In a meadow, somewhere in what we now call Eastern Europe, a farmer's plow catches on something harder than soil. The metal blade skips across an obstruction that shouldn't exist in this carefully cultivated field, leaving behind a scar in the earth that reveals a color different from the rich brown loam that surrounds it. The farmer pauses, wipes sweat from his forehead and kneels to investigate what has interrupted his spring planting. What he finds is a circle of stones, each no larger than his fist, arranged with a precision that speaks of human intention. The stones are blackened on one side, stained with the residue of fires that burned when his ancestors' ancestors were still learning to shape metal. Between the stones, the soil is different, darker, richer, mixed with charcoal and the microscopic remains of meals consumed around warmth that died 10,000 years ago. This is how the lost tribes speak to us now, through arrangements of stone and shadow, through soil that remembers what happened above it. The farmer, driven by curiosity older than agriculture itself, carefully scrapes away more earth, his hands calloused from working land his family has owned for generations, uncover artifacts that connect him to people who knew this same earth when it wore different clothes. When forests stood where his wheat grows, when small bands of humans moved across landscapes that existed without boundaries or names. He finds tools that fit comfortably in his palm, their edges still sharp after millennia of burial stone scrapers, worn smooth by hands that processed hides with the same careful attention his grandmother once gave to preparing wool bone needles, so fine they could pierce leather without tearing it. Testament to skills developed through generations of practice. Each object carries the invisible weight of human intention, the accumulated knowledge of people who understood materials and techniques that died with their last practitioners. But it is what he doesn't find that tells the deeper story. There are no grand monuments here, no carved stones declaring the achievements of kings or the glory of conquering armies, no metal ornaments suggesting accumulated wealth, no evidence of the hierarchies that would later define human societies. The Sioux absence of permanent structure speaks as clearly as their presence might have. These were people who built their lives around movement rather than accumulation, who measured success in survival rather than surplus. The archaeologist who eventually examines this site will catalog each fragment with scientific precision, but even her trained analysis can only hint at the human experiences these objects once facilitated. The scraper that bears microscopic traces of animal fat once moved through hide, held by hands that had learned their craft through seasons. Of necessity, the bone needle that shows wear patterns, consistent with repeated use, was once guided by fingers that understood the difference between stitches meant to last season and those that needed to endure a lifetime. Across the continents, similar discoveries accumulate like pieces of a puzzle that will never be complete. In what is now the American Northwest, coastal erosion reveals a midden, a carefully constructed pile of shells and bones that speaks of generations who returned seasonally to the same gathering places. The arrangement is not random. Layers of different materials alternate in patterns that suggest sophisticated understanding of waste management and soil chemistry. These people knew that certain combinations of organic matter would decompose in ways that enriched the earth for future use. The shells tell stories of harvesting, techniques so efficient they allowed entire communities to thrive on marine resources without depleting them. Size. Distributions indicate careful selection. The largest individuals were often left to reproduce, ensuring that future generations would find abundance where their ancestors had gathered. This was not conservation as we understand it, driven by abstract environmental ethics, but pragmatic wisdom developed through countless cycles of feast and famine. The bones whisper of relationships between humans and animals that existed nowhere else in history. Mixed. Among the shells are the remains of dozens of species, fish, birds, marine mammals, land animals, both large and small. But the pattern of butchering marks the distribution of skeletal elements. The careful processing of every usable part speaks of people who understood their place on the web of life, not as dominators but as participants. These hunters took what they needed and used everything they took. Bones were split to extract marrow, then fashioned into tools. Antlers became handles and digging implements. Even the smallest bird bones were processed to yield sinew for binding and bone for decoration. Nothing was waste, because waste was a luxury these people could not afford. But perhaps the most haunting discoveries are the ones that speak of minds like ours, capable of wonder beyond mere survival. In a cave in what we now call France, researchers have found evidence of the world's oldest known art studio. The floor is stained with ochre, ground so fine it feels like powder between modern fingers. Stone palettes still hold traces of pigments mixed with animal fat and plant extracts, creating colors that have somehow survived 10,000 years of darkness and dampness. The cave walls bear no images. Whatever art was created here was portable, meant to travel with people who could not afford the luxury of permanent galleries, but the sophistication of the pigment preparation suggests artistic traditions as complex as any that would develop in later civilizations. These were not crude experiments in decoration, but refined techniques passed down through generations of practitioners who understood color and composition as thoroughly as they understood survival. The absence of finished artwork makes the studio more mysterious, not less. What did these ancient artists create? Decorated clothing that has long since returned to earth. Ceremonial objects that were too sacred to leave behind in burial sites. Body paint that transformed hunters into spirits, gatherers into forces of nature. The pigments could have served any of these purposes, or all of them, or others that our modern minds cannot even imagine. The grinding stones show wear patterns that suggest decades of use. The same hands that shaped spear points and processed hides also mixed colors with the patience of people who understood that beauty, like survival, required both skill and time. These artists worked by firelight, their shadows dancing on stone walls as they prepared materials for arts that would never be preserved in any museum, would never be photographed or analyzed or celebrated by cultures that came after. In the high mountains of Central Asia, archaeologists have discovered sites that challenge every assumption about prehistoric capabilities. At altitudes where modern humans require special equipment to function effectively, ancient people established what can only be called workshops, places where they gathered to produce tools of such sophistication that experts initially refused to believe their age. The dating methods were checked and rechecked. The contexts were analyzed and reanalyzed, but the evidence remained consistent. People were creating advanced technologies in these mountain fastnesses when the rest of the world was supposedly struggling with basic survival. The tools themselves are marvels of engineering, composite implements that combine stone, bone, and wood in ways that maximize efficiency while minimizing weight. Spear points that could be easily repaired in the field, knife blades that held edges sharp enough to perform surgery, scrapers designed with ergonomic principles that modern tool designers have only recently rediscovered. Each piece represents hundreds of hours of experimentation, testing, and refinement. But the most remarkable aspect of these sites is their temporary nature. Despite the sophistication of the work performed there, these were not permanent settlements. The workshops were used intensively for perhaps a few weeks each year, then abandoned until the following season. The people who created such advanced tools were still following the ancient rhythms of nomadic life, still moving across landscapes according to patterns that prioritize flexibility over accumulation. The seasonal use of these sites suggests social organizations of staggering complexity. That groups from different regions must have coordinated their movements to arrive at the workshop simultaneously. Knowledge about tool-making techniques was shared across vast distances, with innovations developed in one location, spreading through networks that spanned continents. These people maintained cultural connections, despite being scattered across territories larger than modern nations. The mystery deepens when we consider the evidence for ritual and ceremony. Mixed. Among the tool-making debris are objects that serve no practical purpose, at least no purpose that archaeologists can identify. Carefully shaped stones that fit perfectly in human hands, but show no signs of use as tools. Bone carvings that suggest symbolic rather than functional intent. Arrangements of natural objects that seem to follow patterns,
meaningful to their creators but incomprehensible to modern
observers. One site in particular has yielded what researchers hesitantly call an altar, a flat stone surface, surrounded by smaller stones, arranged in precise geometric patterns. The central stone shows evidence of repeated burning, but chemical analysis reveals no traces of food preparation. Whatever was burned here left no residue that modern science can identify, suggesting ceremonies involving materials that have completely decomposed, or practices so different from our experience that we lack the conceptual framework to understand them. The burials, when they are found, speak of beliefs about death and transformation that we can glimpse but never fully comprehend. Unlike the elaborate tombs that would characterize later civilizations, these graves are marked by their restraint. Bodies were placed in simple pits, accompanied by a few personal tools and what appear to be offerings of food. But the positioning of the remains, the orientation of the graves, the careful selection of burial goods, all suggest complex beliefs about what happened to human consciousness after breathing stopped. In one particularly puzzling site, archaeologists found a burial where the deceased was surrounded by hundreds of small stone tools, each one broken in a specific way. The breakage patterns are too consistent to be accidental, too complex to be random. Someone, perhaps the entire community, invested enormous amounts of time and skill in creating tools specifically to be destroyed as part of the burial ritual. This suggests beliefs about the afterlife that required the dead to be equipped with implements that existed in some transformed state, tools that had been killed so they could serve in whatever realm awaited beyond death. But perhaps the most haunting discoveries are the ones that speak of failure and abandonment. Sites that show evidence of sudden departure, meals half prepared and left to burn, in fires that eventually died from neglect. Tools scattered, as if dropped by people who had to leave immediately, taking only what they could carry in their hands. These archaeological snapshots capture moments when the careful balance that sustained nomadic life suddenly collapsed, when the systems that had supported communities for generations proved insufficient to meet new challenges. One such site preserves what researchers call a catastrophic abandonment, evidence that an entire band of perhaps 30 people left their encampment so quickly that they abandoned resources it would have taken weeks to replace. Partially completed tools were left exactly where their makers had been working on them. Food was left cooking in earth ovens that eventually collapsed from neglect. Personal ornaments were scattered across the camp, as if people had fled while getting dressed. What could have caused such precipitous flight remains a mystery that soil and stone cannot answer. The abandonment level shows no evidence of violence, no signs of conflict or destruction. Whatever drove these people away left no trace that modern archaeology can detect. Climate data suggests no sudden environmental catastrophe. The remains of their fires indicate they had adequate fuel, Animal bones scattered through the site suggest hunting had been successful, yet something made them leave everything behind and disappear into landscapes that have yielded no further evidence of their passage. Their story ends in an archaeological moment that preserves their flight but not their destination, their fear but not its source, their decision but not their reasoning. Across continents and millennia, similar patterns repeat themselves. Societies that flourished for centuries suddenly vanishing without explanation. In each case, the archaeological record shows the same progression. Periods of apparent stability and success, evidence of sophisticated adaptation to local environments, signs of cultural innovation and artistic achievement, then sudden silence. The material culture that had been accumulating for generations disappears from the archaeological record as completely as if it had never existed. Some researchers suggest climate change as the driving force behind these disappearances, but the timing rarely matches the environmental data. Others propose disease, but epidemic illness typically leaves recognizable traces in human remains. Still others argue for social collapse, but the evidence suggests these societies were functioning effectively right up to the moment of their disappearance. The mystery is deepened by the occasional discovery of sites that suggest these lost peoples may have had knowledge. We still don't understand astronomical alignments that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of celestial mechanics, engineering solutions that solve problems. Modern architects struggle with agricultural techniques that produce sustainable abundance in environments we consider marginal. These discoveries hint at bodies of knowledge that developed along completely different trajectories than the traditions that eventually gave rise to recorded history. In what is now Turkey, archaeologists have uncovered a settlement that appears to have been deliberately buried, not destroyed, not abandoned, but carefully covered with soil, as if the daunted inhabitants wanted to preserve it for some future rediscovery. The buildings were cleaned before burial, valuable objects were removed, and the entire site was covered with a layer of earth that protected the structures from weathering and decay. Why would people invest enormous labor in preserving a settlement they were leaving forever? The burial was so thorough, so carefully executed that it could only have been accomplished by the site's original inhabitants. They knew exactly how the buildings were constructed, which walls needed additional support, how to create drainage systems that would prevent water damage during the centuries of burial. This was not the work of conquerors covering evidence of destruction, but of people who wanted their home to survive them. The preservation is so complete that archaeologists can see the details of daily life frozen at the moment of abandonment. Cooking pots still sit where they were placed. Tools hang from pegs on the walls. Sleeping areas retain the impressions of bodies that rested there the night before the great burial began. It's as if the inhabitants expected to return someday, as if the burial was temporary protection rather than permanent abandonment. But no one ever came back. The site remained buried for thousands of years, undisturbed until modern excavation revealed it. Whatever the inhabitants were trying to preserve it from never materialized, or perhaps proved so overwhelming that return became impossible. Their careful preparation became a time capsule that preserved their world for people who would have been as alien to them as they are to us. Similar sites have been found across the world, suggesting that this pattern of careful preservation before disappearance was not unique to one culture or region. People separated by thousands of miles and centuries employed similar strategies for protecting their settlements before vanishing from the historical record. They shared not just techniques, but perhaps a common understanding of impending changes that required such drastic responses. The implications are staggering. These discoveries suggest that prehistoric peoples may have possessed predictive capabilities. We don't understand knowledge systems that allowed them to anticipate changes decades or centuries before they occurred. They could prepare for departures that wouldn't happen for generations, could organize preservation efforts that required community-wide cooperation over extended periods. Or perhaps they were responding to changes that were already underway but invisible to us. environmental shifts too subtle for modern instruments to detect, social pressures that left no archaeological traces, spiritual crises that we lack the conceptual framework to recognize. Their careful preparations might have been responses to realities. We cannot perceive solutions to problems we don't know how to identify. In the end, the archaeological record raises more questions than it answers. Every discovery that illuminates one aspect of these lost cultures creates shadows elsewhere. Every question that finds a tentative answer generates a dozen new mysteries. The more we learn about the sophistication of prehistoric societies, the more puzzling their disappearance becomes. The tools we find speak of knowledge, traditions that took centuries to develop, yet vanished so completely that later cultures had to reinvent basic techniques from scratch. The art supplies suggest aesthetic sensibilities as refined as any in recorded history, yet we have no examples of the art they were used to creating. The burial sites indicate complex spiritual beliefs, yet we can only guess at the mythologies and philosophies that gave those beliefs meaning. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not what happened to these lost tribes, but what they knew that we have forgotten. Their sustainable relationships with their environments, their non-hierarchical social organizations, their integration of practical skills with artistic expression, their understanding of landscape and season and the subtle rhythms that governed successful survival. All of this knowledge disappeared as completely as if it had never existed. We are left with fragments and shadows, with carefully preserved pigments that once created unknown masterpieces, with tools designed for tasks we can no longer identify with burial, practices that honored beliefs we cannot comprehend. The earth holds their traces like a library written in a language we have never learned to read, and yet in quiet moments when archaeology gives way to but imagination, we might glimpse what we have lost. The hand-ground pigments speak of artists who understood color as medicine, decoration as prayer, beauty as survival strategy. The carefully broken tools suggest beliefs about death that honored both the living and the departed, that saw transformation, rather than ending at the moment when breathing stopped. The deliberately buried settlements hint at people who thought in geological time, who made preparations for futures they would never see. These were people who lived fully in their present, while maintaining connections to both deep past and distant future. They carried forward knowledge inherited from countless previous generations, while adapting and innovating to meet changing circumstances. They understood themselves as temporary expressions of something larger and more permanent than individual consciousness. Their disappearance may have been less catastrophe than transformation. Perhaps they didn't vanish so much as evolve, changing in ways that left no archaeological traces, because the changes were more fundamental than simple cultural adaptation. Perhaps they found solutions to problems that threatened not just their individual survival, but the sustainability of human presence on Earth, solutions that required abandoning the material cultures that we use to identify and study them. Or, perhaps their knowledge became so refined, so perfectly adapted to the natural systems they inhabited that it became invisible to us, integrated so completely with landscape and season, that we cannot distinguish their presence from the natural background. Perhaps they achieved a form of civilization that left no scars on the earth, created no monuments to human ego, built no structures that would outlast the people who used them. In the end, their silence may be their most eloquent statement. In a world that increasingly values noise over wisdom, accumulation over adaptation, conquest over cooperation, the lost tribes speak through their absence. Their vanishing serves as commentary on the paths not taken, the possibilities abandoned in favor of approaches that emphasized domination over integration. They remind us that civilization is not synonymous with permanence, that sophistication does not require monumentality, that success cannot be measured solely by what survives to be catalogued and studied. They suggest that some forms of knowledge are too subtle for preservation in stone or metal, too integrated for separation from the living systems that gave them meaning. As we drift toward sleep, let their mystery be our guide. In dreams, perhaps we might remember what it felt like to live so lightly that our passage left only whispers in the soil. In sleep, perhaps we might recall the knowledge that allowed small bands of humans to thrive for millennia, without destroying the systems that sustained them. In the quiet hours before dawn, perhaps we might glimpse the wisdom that the lost tribes carried with them into whatever transformation awaited beyond the edge of history. Their story continues in the spaces between what we know and what we have, forgotten in the silence that surrounds all our speaking, in the earth that holds all our traces and remembers everything we choose to abandon. They are not lost, perhaps, but simply waiting for us to develop the sensitivity necessary to hear their ongoing whispers, to recognize their presence in the wind, through ancient grasslands, in the patient arrangements of stone and shadow, that speak to those who know how to listen. As the echoes of buried mysteries fade into comfortable silence, let us drift toward a different kind of existence, one that emerged as the nomadic world was disappearing. Built upon foundations that the wandering tribes would never understand, in a valley that had known only seasonal visitors for countless generations, something unprecedented was taking shape. Where Tal's people might have camped for a few weeks during their endless migrations, other humans were creating something that would outlast individual lifetimes, the first permanent settlement in a region that had never seen walls that remained standing through winter's harsh passage. The man who would become the settlement's first chief had been born into a nomadic band, not unlike Tal's people, but circumstances had taught him lessons that previous generations had never needed to learn. A childhood injury that left him unable to keep pace with seasonal migrations, an unusually harsh winter that killed most of his birth tribe, a chance encounter with others who had been similarly displaced by changes too large for individual adaptation. All of these experiences had prepared him for thoughts that nomadic minds found almost incomprehensible. Imagine him in those first years, when permanence was still an experiment rather than an assumption. His name was Kamal, though the sounds that formed it would be meaningless in any language spoken today. He stood at the edge of what would become humanity's first agricultural revolution, but he could not have understood the magnitude of the transformation he was helping to create. To him, the decision to build structures that would survive multiple seasons was simply a practical response to circumstances that made traditional nomadic strategies impractical. The valley he chose offered advantages that nomadic peoples had always recognized but never thought to exploit permanently. A reliable water source that flowed year-round, soil rich enough to support intensive plant cultivation, natural barriers that provided protection from both weather and potential enemies. What made Kamal different was not his ability to recognize these advantages, but his willingness to commit to them exclusively, abandoning the flexibility that had been humanity's primary survival strategy for millennia. The first permanent structure was little more than an enlarged version of traditional temporary shelters. Kamal and his followers, refugees from failed nomadic bands, individuals whose injuries or age made migration difficult, people who had grown weary of the constant uncertainty that defined traditional life, began by building something that looked familiar. Wooden frames covered with animal hides designed to keep out wind and rain, while allowing for the circulation of air that prevented the accumulation of dangerous moisture. But unlike temporary shelters, these structures were built with the assumption that they would need to last. The wooden frames were sunk deeper into the earth, creating foundations that could resist the frost heave cycles that destroyed temporary constructions. The hides were treated with additional care, processed using techniques that prioritized durability over the quick turnaround that nomadic life demanded. Each element of construction was considered, not just for immediate function but for long-term performance. The psychological adjustment required for this shift cannot be overstated. Nomadic peoples lived with the assumption that anything they built would eventually be abandoned. That permanence was not just impossible but actually undesirable. Kamal's people had to learn to think in terms of seasons and years rather than days and weeks, to invest labor in projects whose benefits would not be immediately apparent. The first harvest changed everything. During their nomadic years, Kamal's people had gathered wild grains when they encountered them, taking what nature offered without attempting to influence the process. But permanent settlement created the possibility of a fundamentally different relationship with plant resources, the ability to encourage preferred species, to select for characteristics that served human needs, to gradually transform wild landscapes into managed ecosystems. The transition was not immediate or dramatic. In the early years, the settlement's diet still consisted primarily of hunted animals and gathered wild plants. But gradually, the small plots of land where grain seeds had been scattered began to produce more reliable yields than random gathering. The women who tended these plots began to notice patterns. Which plants grew best? In which locations which seeds produced the most abundant harvests? Which techniques for soil preparation increased productivity? Kamal watched this transformation with fascination and growing unease. The abundance that careful cultivation could produce was undeniable, but it came at a cost that nomadic thinking found difficult to accept. The plots required constant attention, daily labor that tied people to specific locations during critical growing seasons. The stored surplus that made winter survival more predictable also created the need for protection, for social arrangements that could defend accumulated resources against those who might prefer taking to producing. With surplus came the possibility of specialization, and with specialization came inequality. In nomadic bands, everyone's survival depended on their ability to contribute to the group's collective needs. The elderly shared knowledge, the strong provided labor, the skilled taught techniques. But no one could survive by depending solely on the work of others. The settlement's growing agricultural surplus changed this fundamental equation, creating the possibility that some people could contribute to group survival without engaging directly in food production. Kamal found himself becoming the settlement's first full-time administrator, spending his days making decisions about resource allocation, resolving disputes between families and planning for seasonal challenges that permanent settlement created. His knowledge of the valley's resources, his experience with both nomadic and settled strategies, his ability to think beyond immediate survival needs, all of these qualities made him valuable in ways that transcended his physical contributions to daily labor. But this specialization came with consequences that no one had anticipated. As Kamal spent less time in direct food production, he began to depend on the surplus created by others. This dependence created relationships of obligation and authority that had no equivalent. In nomadic society, people brought him food, not out of reciprocal sharing, but in recognition of his special role in ensuring the settlement's survival. The first winter in permanent settlement revealed both the advantages and the costs of abandoning nomadic flexibility. When the cold season arrived, Kamal's people faced it from behind walls that provided unprecedented protection from wind and weather. Their stored grain supplies meant they could survive without the constant foraging that made nomadic winters so precarious. The specialized knowledge that different individuals had developed allowed them to maintain and repair their structures, to process food more efficiently, to create tools and clothing better suited to their new way of life. But they also discovered vulnerabilities that nomadic peoples had never needed to consider. Their fixed location made them visible to anyone who might be traveling through the valley. Their accumulated surplus made them targets for groups who preferred raiding to production. Their dependence on stored resources meant that any loss, whether to theft, spoilage, or natural disaster, could threaten the entire community's survival. During the coldest months, when travel was most difficult and the settlement was most isolated, tensions emerged that nomadic bands had rarely experienced. Disputes over resource allocation became more serious when resolution required people to continue living together rather than simply separating into different groups. Personality conflicts that might have been resolved through temporary separation became chronic sources of stress. When permanent residence made avoidance impossible, Kamal found himself making decisions that nomadic leaders had never needed to consider. The question of who deserved access to stored resources when supplies ran low required judgments about individual contributions that nomadic sharing customs had never needed to formalize. The problem of maintaining order when people disagreed about priorities demanded authority structures that traditional consensus building could not easily accommodate. The challenge of planning for future seasons required commitments that restricted individual choice in ways that nomadic flexibility had always avoided. These decisions gradually transformed Kamal from a skilled coordinator into something that had never existed in human society. A permanent leader whose authority derived not from immediate consensus, but from his control over resources that others needed for survival. He did not seek this power. It emerged from the logic of permanent settlement, as naturally as plants grew from carefully tended soil. His living space began to reflect his changing status. While other families continued to occupy single-room structures, similar to traditional shelters, Kamal's dwelling expanded to include space for storing the records he was learning to keep. 4. Meeting with individuals who sought his arbitration of disputes, for the planning sessions that permanent settlement required. The extra space was justified by practical necessity, but it also served as a visible symbol of his emerging authority. The second year brought visitors who would change the settlement's relationship with the outside world. The first travelers to encounter Kamal's permanent settlement were members of a nomadic band whose traditional territory included the valley where the experiment in settled life was taking place. Their reaction was a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and incomprehension. The idea that people would voluntarily surrender the freedom of movement that defined human existence struck them as both foolish and somehow dangerous. The negotiations that followed established patterns that would govern human interactions for millennia to come. The nomads needed access to the valley's resources during certain seasons, but they were willing to acknowledge the settlers' claims to exclusive use during other periods. In exchange for this accommodation, they offered information about conditions in distant territories, trade goods that the settlement could not produce for itself, and military alliance against threats that might be too large for either group to handle alone. But the relationship was fundamentally unequal in ways that both sides struggled to understand. The nomads possessed mobility and knowledge of vast territories, but they could not match the settlers' ability to accumulate and store resources. The settlers had surplus and specialized skills, but they lacked the flexibility to respond to changing conditions through movement. Each group had become dependent on capabilities that the other possessed. Trade relationships gradually evolved. That would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations. Kamal found himself managing exchanges that involved not just immediate reciprocity, but complex calculations about future value. The nomads might bring furs and exotic stones in exchange for grain and processed goods, but these transactions required agreements about quantities, qualities, and timing that traditional gift exchange systems could not accommodate. The need to evaluate different types of goods to store value across seasons to maintain relationships with groups that might not return for months or years. All of these challenges pushed the settlement toward innovations that would eventually become fundamental to human civilization. Systems for recording transactions, standards for measuring quantities, concepts of debt and credit that could span multiple seasons. All of these developments emerged from the practical requirements of managing trade relationships between settled and nomadic peoples. Kamal's role in these exchanges further elevated his status within the settlement. His knowledge of negotiation techniques, his understanding of different groups' needs and capabilities, his ability to plan for future transactions, all of these skills made him indispensable in ways that extended far beyond internal community management. He became the settlement's primary interface with the outside world, its representative in dealings that could affect everyone's survival. The third year brought the first clear evidence that the experiment in permanent settlement was creating something entirely new in human experience. The children born in the settlement during its early years had never known nomadic life. Their understanding of space and time, their assumptions about security and risk, their relationships with the natural world, all of these fundamental aspects of human consciousness were shaped by experiences that their grandparents would have found alien. They took for granted the availability of stored food, the protection of permanent walls, the presence of adults who specialized in activities other than direct survival tasks. These children learned different skills than nomadic youth, developed different relationships with their environment, and formed different expectations about their own futures. They assumed that the place where they were born would continue to exist throughout their lives, that the social arrangements that governed their childhood would persist into their adulthood, that innovation and improvement were possible in ways that nomadic life had never encouraged. Watching these children grow, Kamal began to understand that he had helped create not just a new way of living, but a new kind of human consciousness. The transformation was irreversible, even if the settlement failed, even if circumstances forced its abandonment. The ideas and expectations that permanent residence had created would persist in the minds of those who had experienced it. The fourth year brought the first signs of the social stratification that would characterize all future civilizations. As the settlement's population grew and its economic base became more complex, the informal authority that Kamal had initially exercised began to formalize into institutions that could survive. Changes in leadership. Decisions that had once been made through discussion and consensus were increasingly delegated to individuals who possessed specialized knowledge or controlled essential resources. The families who had been most successful in agricultural production found their surplus, giving them influence over community decisions. The individuals who had developed specialized skills in tool-making, construction, or trade found their expertise translating into social status. The people who could trace their residence in the settlement to its earliest days claimed precedence over more recent arrivals. Kamal watched these developments with mixed feelings. The increasing complexity of social organization was clearly necessary for managing a community that had grown beyond the size where everyone could know everyone else intimately. But the emergence of permanent hierarchies violated principles of equality that had governed human societies for thousands of years. His own position at the top of these emerging hierarchies gave him advantages that he had never imagined during his nomadic youth. His dwelling had expanded to include multiple rooms, each serving specialized functions that ordinary families could not afford to maintain. His clothing reflected the quality of materials and craftsmanship that the settlement's most skilled producers reserved for their most important customers. His diet included foods that required intensive preparation, exotic ingredients obtained through trade, and portions that reflected abundance rather than careful rationing. But with privilege came responsibilities and isolation that nomadic leaders had never experienced. The decisions that Kamal made increasingly affected the lives of people he barely knew personally. The policies he established would shape the community's development for years to come. The precedents he set would influence social arrangements long after his death. The weight of these responsibilities was unlike anything that nomadic leadership had ever required. His relationships with other community members became increasingly formal and distant. People approached him with specific requests rather than engaging in the casual interaction that had characterized nomadic social life. His opinions carried authority that made spontaneous discussion difficult. His presence changed the dynamic of any gathering, creating awareness of status differences that nomadic customs had worked to minimize. Even his family relationships were affected by his position. His children were treated differently by other community members, given deference that reflected their father's status rather than their own achievements. His wife found herself occupying a social position that had no equivalent in nomadic society, neither a leader in her own right nor simply another community member, but something in between. That required the navigation of social complexities that had never existed before. The fifth year brought external challenges that tested the settlement's new social arrangements. A drought that lasted longer than anyone could remember created the first serious shortage of resources since the community's founding. The agricultural surplus that had seemed so reliable proved vulnerable to conditions that nomadic peoples could have addressed by moving to more favored regions. The settlement's commitment to permanent location meant that its members had to survive the crisis, where they were using whatever resources they could access or create locally. The crisis revealed both the strengths and the weaknesses of the social systems that had evolved during the settlement's growth. Kamal's authority allowed for rapid decision-making about resource allocation, work assignments, and long-term planning that nomadic consensus building might not have achieved quickly enough to address urgent needs. The specialization that different community members had developed provided expertise in food preservation, water management, and alternative resource acquisition that generalist nomadic knowledge might not have encompassed. But the inequality that had emerged during prosperous times became a source of tension. When scarcity required sacrifice, the families who had accumulated the largest surpluses were reluctant to share them equally with those who had been less successful. The individuals who possessed specialized skills demanded compensation that reflected their enhanced value. During crisis conditions, the social arrangements that had seemed natural and beneficial during abundance proved divisive when survival required cooperation. Kamal found himself making decisions that would have been unthinkable in nomadic society. When stored grain supplies ran dangerously low, he had to decide which families would receive full rations and which would be asked to accept reduced allocations. When work parties were organized to search for alternative food sources, he had to determine who would be assigned to dangerous tasks and who would remain in the dark relative safety of the settlement. When trade expeditions were planned to seek resources from distant communities, he had to choose who would be sent away during the community's most vulnerable period. These decisions required moral calculations that nomadic leaders had rarely needed to make. In traditional societies, resource scarcity typically led to group dispersal, with individual families or small bands separating to reduce pressure on available supplies. But permanent settlement made such solutions impossible. The community's investment in agriculture, construction, and storage systems could not be abandoned without losing everything that had been built. The authority to make life-and-death decisions about resource allocation gradually transformed Kamal's relationship with the community. He led people who disagreed with his choices could not simply leave to join other groups. Their investment in the settlement's infrastructure made departure extremely costly. Those who benefited from his decisions owed him gratitude that extended beyond simple reciprocity. Those who suffered from his choices harbored resentments that personal mobility had traditionally allowed to dissipate. The crisis passed, but its effects on the community's social structure were permanent. When seasonal rains finally returned, and agricultural production resumed its previous levels, the settlement had been fundamentally changed by its experience with scarcity. The informal authority structures that had emerged during prosperous times had been tested and formalized through their use in crisis management. The social hierarchies that had seemed temporary and situational had proven their utility and become institutionalized. Kamal's position had evolved from coordinator to ruler, his authority no longer dependent on consensus but established through demonstrated capability in managing existential challenges. The families who had cooperated most effectively with his leadership during the crisis found their status enhanced in the post-crisis social order. The individuals who had resisted his decisions or questioned his authority found themselves marginalized in ways that had no equivalent in nomadic society. The settlement's success in surviving its first major crisis also attracted attention from surrounding regions. Other communities that had experimented with permanent residence sent representatives to learn about techniques and strategies that had proven effective. Nomadic groups that had previously viewed settled life as an interesting aberration began to consider it as a viable alternative to traditional mobility. By the 6th year, Kamal's settlement had become the center of a regional network that would have been impossible under nomadic organization. The trade relationships that had begun as simple exchanges between the settlement and passing nomadic bands had evolved into complex commercial networks involving multiple permanent communities and dozens of nomadic groups. The settlement served as a hub where goods from vast distances could be stored, processed, and redistributed according to demand patterns that required long-term planning and sophisticated coordination. Kamal found himself managing relationships with leaders whose authority structures were similar to his own, but whose communities had developed different solutions to the challenges of permanent residence. Some settlements had emphasized military organization, creating warrior classes that specialized in defense and conquest. Others had focused on craft production, developing artisan guilds that created goods of unprecedented quality and complexity. Still others had concentrated on religious activities, establishing priestly hierarchies that claimed divine sanction for their authority. The diversity of these approaches to permanent settlement created opportunities for specialization and exchange that nomadic organization had never supported. The settlement could focus its development on agricultural production, while trading with communities that specialized in manufacturing or military services. This regional division of labor created efficiencies and innovations that isolated communities could never have achieved. But these advantages came with vulnerabilities that nomadic peoples had never needed to consider. The settlement's dependence on trade relationships for essential resources meant that disruptions in the regional network could create shortages, more severe than anything that local resource scarcity might cause. The community's specialization in agricultural production left it vulnerable to military attack by groups that had emphasized warrior training. The social hierarchies that had proven effective for internal organization created targets for external groups that might benefit from disrupting established leadership structures. Kamal's advanced age began to create additional challenges as the settlement entered its 7th year. His accumulated knowledge and established relationships made him irreplaceable in ways that nomadic leadership had never allowed. The authority, structures that had evolved around his personal characteristics could not easily be transferred to potential successors. The community faced the prospect of leadership transition in circumstances where failure could threaten not just individual survival, but the entire experiment in permanent settlement. The question of succession revealed problems that nomadic societies had never needed to solve. In traditional bands, leadership had been situational and temporary, with different individuals taking primary responsibility for decisions depending on circumstances and expertise. The death or incapacity of any particular leader created minimal disruption because authority was distributed and flexible, But Kamal's role had become so central to the settlement's functioning that his replacement required systematic preparation and community acceptance in ways that had no precedent in human experience. The individuals who possessed the knowledge and skills necessary to replace Kamal were not necessarily those who commanded the respect and loyalty that his authority required. The people who had demonstrated leadership capability in specific areas might not possess the broad understanding that community management demanded. The family members who might claim hereditary rights to succession had not necessarily been prepared for the responsibilities that leadership entailed. These challenges forced the community to develop new concepts about authority, legitimacy, and social organization that would influence human civilization for millennia to come. The idea that leadership roles could be inherited, that authority could be transferred through formal procedures, that communities could survive the death of individual leaders through institutional continuity. All of these innovations emerged from the practical requirements of managing permanent settlements. Kamal's death, when it came, marked the end of an era that had begun with nomadic flexibility and ended with hierarchical complexity. His funeral was the first ceremony in human history designed to honor an individual whose importance transcended personal relationships. The rituals that marked his passing had to acknowledge not just his role as community member, but his function as institutional leader. The burial goods that accompanied him reflected not just personal achievement, but social status that had no equivalent in nomadic tradition. The succession process that followed his death established precedents that would govern human social organization for thousands of years. The community's decision to transfer authority to his eldest son created the first dynastic leadership in human history. The ceremonies that legitimized this transfer invented concepts of hereditary rule that would eventually spread across continents. But the most significant change was not in the structures of authority, but in the consciousness of those who lived within them. The people of Kamal's settlement had learned to think of themselves not as temporary occupants of changing landscapes, but as permanent inhabitants of a specific place. They had developed identities tied to location rather than kinship, loyalties directed toward institutions rather than individuals, expectations about the future that assumed continuity rather than change. This transformation of consciousness was irreversible. Even if the settlement had failed, even if its inhabitants had been forced to return to nomadic life, they would have carried with them concepts and expectations that would have influenced any future attempts at permanent residence. The knowledge that surplus could be accumulated, that specialization could create efficiencies, that authority could be formalized and transferred, that communities could survive beyond the lifetimes of their founders. All of these ideas had been proven possible in ways that could never be forgotten. The children who had grown up in the settlement carried within their minds a completely different understanding of human possibility than any previous generation had possessed. They assumed that improvement was possible, that individuals could influence their circumstances through sustained effort, that communities could grow and develop in ways that nomadic organization had never supported. As we drift towards sleep, imagine the vast gulf that separated these two ways of understanding human existence. Tall's people had lived with intimate knowledge of landscape and season, moving through the world with the lightness of those who owned nothing they could not carry. Their wealth consisted of knowledge and relationships. Their security came from flexibility and adaptation. Their legacy existed in the minds of their children rather than in permanent monuments. Kamal's people had created abundance through commitment to place, accumulating resources and developing technologies that nomadic life could never have supported. Their wealth consisted of stored surplus and productive infrastructure. Their security came from walls and weapons. Their legacy existed in institutions and precedents that would outlive their creators. Neither way of life was inherently superior to the other both represented sophisticated adaptations to the challenges of human survival. Both created forms of knowledge and social organization that served their practitioners well, but they were incompatible in ways that made conflict inevitable and coexistence impossible. The world that Kamal helped create would eventually spread across every continent, transforming landscapes and consciousness in ways that the nomadic peoples could never have imagined. Cities would rise where seasonal camps had once been erected and abandoned. Agriculture would replace gathering. Animal husbandry would replace hunting. Written records would replace oral tradition. The flexibility that had allowed humans to survive ice ages and climate changes would be traded for the productivity that could support vastly larger populations in permanent settlements. But something would be lost in this transformation. The intimate relationship with natural systems that nomadic life had required, the egalitarian social arrangements that mobility had encouraged, the lightness of existence that came from owning nothing that could not be carried. The knowledge that Tal's people had accumulated over millennia of successful adaptation would disappear as completely as if it had never existed. In our dreams tonight, perhaps, we can glimpse both worlds, the freedom of endless horizons and the security of permanent walls, the democracy of survival and the efficiency of hierarchy, the wisdom of adaptation and the power of control, and the life you have always known and the life you will never touch. Both exist within the deeper patterns of human possibility. Both whisper their truths in the quiet hours when consciousness drifts between waking and sleeping, in the space between what was and what became, between the life that moves and the life that stays, between the people who left no traces and the people who carved their names in stone. We might find the dreams that connect all human experience across the vast spaces of time and choice. As our journey through the landscapes of the lost draws to its gentle close, let us rest for a moment in the vast silence that holds both Tal's footsteps and Kamal's walls, both the wisdom that moved with the seasons and the knowledge that accumulated behind permanent barriers. We have traveled together through worlds that existed before anyone thought to preserve them in writing, before anyone imagined that human stories might outlast human voices. We have walked with people who measured wealth and wisdom and counted success and seasons survived. We have witnessed the transformation that turned wanderers into settlers, flexibility into permanence, equality into hierarchy, presence into possession. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your own permanent shelter, surrounded by accumulated objects that nomadic peoples could never have imagined owning, consider the strange journey that brought you to this moment, the bed that supports your rest, the walls that provide your security, the stored food that eliminates your hunger, the controlled climate that banishes discomfort. All of these luxuries exist because people like Kamal chose permanence over freedom, accumulation over adaptation. But somewhere in your dreams, Tal's people are still walking. They move through landscapes that exist now only in imagination, following seasonal rhythms that civilization has forgotten, carrying knowledge that was never written down because it was too subtle for words, too integrated for separation from the living systems that gave it meaning. Their wisdom whispers in the wind that still moves through ancient grasslands, in the patient arrangements of stone and shadow that speak to those who remember how to listen. The contrast between their world and ours is not a judgment, but a meditation on the choices that shaped human consciousness. Neither path was inevitable. Neither outcome was predetermined. The transformation from nomadic mobility to settled permanence happened because countless individuals made countless small decisions that gradually accumulated into civilizational change. We are the beneficiaries of that transformation, but we are also its prisoners. The abundance that permanent settlement created allows us to imagine alternatives to survival, to pursue knowledge for its own sake, to create art and music and stories that serve no immediate practical purpose. The security that accumulation frees us from the constant calculation of risk that governed every moment of nomadic existence. To specialization that hierarchy enables allows individuals to develop capabilities that generalist survival strategies could never have supported, but we have also inherited the vulnerabilities that permanent settlement created. Our dependence on complex systems makes us fragile in ways that nomadic peoples never experienced. Our separation from natural processes makes us ignorant of knowledge that earlier humans took for granted. Our hierarchical social arrangements create inequalities and tensions that traditional egalitarian customs work to prevent. Perhaps the greatest loss is not practical but psychological. People lived with the assumption that they belonged to the world rather than owning it, that they were participants in natural processes rather than controllers of them, that their presence should enhance rather than diminish the landscapes that sustained them. This understanding created a form of consciousness that we can barely imagine, minds that thought in cycles rather than lines, that measured success through integration rather than domination, that found security in adaptation rather than control. The permanent settlements that replaced nomadic camps were not just different ways of organizing material life. They were different ways of understanding human existence itself. The shift from movement to location, from sharing to accumulation, from consensus to authority, from adaptation to control. All of these changes reflected fundamental alterations in how humans understood their place in the larger patterns of existence, yet both forms of consciousness persist in the deeper levels of human awareness. In quiet moments, when the noise of civilization fades and the rhythms of natural systems become audible, we might glimpse the world as Tall's people experienced it in dreams. When the boundaries of ownership dissolve and the landscapes of imagination expand beyond the constraints of permanent residence, we might remember what it felt like to belong to something larger than individual consciousness. The lost tribes are not truly lost. They exist in the parts of human awareness that civilization has covered but not destroyed. Their knowledge whispers in intuitions that we cannot explain. Their wisdom surfaces in moments when artificial divisions between self and world temporarily disappear. Their understanding guides dreams that carry messages from times when humans lived as integral parts of the systems that sustained them. Tonight, as sleep carries you beyond the boundaries of waking consciousness, let their presence be your guide. Rest in the knowledge that every human life connects to depths of experience that extend far beneath the surface of recorded history. Trust that your dreams might carry messages from ancestors whose names were never written down, but whose wisdom shaped the genetic and cultural inheritance that brought you to this moment. Sleep with the understanding that consciousness itself is larger than individual awareness, that human experience includes possibilities that civilization has forgotten, but not destroyed, that the silence that surrounds all our speaking holds treasures that words could never contain. The lost tribes speak most clearly in the spaces between thoughts, in the pauses between breaths, in the quiet hours when the boundaries between past and present become permeable. They remind us that every ending is also a beginning, that every disappearance creates space for new emergence, that the patterns of human experience cycle through transformations that preserve essence while changing form. Their stories continue in ways that transcend the particular narratives we tell about them, in processes that connect individual consciousness to larger patterns of meaning and purpose. As you drift into sleep, carry with you the comfort of knowing that you are part of something much larger and more enduring than the circumstances of your individual existence. The same forces that guided Tal through her seasons of survival and Kamal, through his experiments in permanence, continue to work through every human life, creating possibilities for adaptation and growth that each generation must discover anew. Let their silence be your peace, their mystery be your rest, their endless journey be your dreams. In sleep, We all return to the nomadic consciousness that civilization has never entirely erased. In dreams, we all become wanderers, moving through landscapes that exist beyond the boundaries of permanent residence. In the quiet hours before dawn, we all remember, however briefly, the wisdom that earlier humans carried like songs in their hearts, like maps in their bones, like prayers in their footsteps across the endless patient earth. Sleep well, fellow traveler. Rest in the knowledge that you carry within your consciousness the accumulated experience of every human generation that came before. Dream, in the certainty that the lost tribes were never truly lost. They live on in the deeper patterns of awareness that connect all human experience across the vast expanses of time and change. The earth remembers everything. The silence holds all stories. The darkness that cradles your sleep tonight is the same darkness that held Kamal's dreams, that embraced Kamal's visions, that continues to nurture the endless human journey through landscapes of possibility that exist as much in consciousness as in the physical world. Rest now. Dream well. Let the lost tribes guide you through the country of sleep, where all boundaries dissolve, and all stories continue in the eternal rhythm of human consciousness exploring its own infinite depths. And in the morning, if you remember, you will know that you have never been alone.